Life in the suburbs of Sacramento, California, was usually slow. Residents of this quiet neighborhood valued privacy and the predictability of their surroundings. One house on the street always caught my eye for its well-kept, family-like appearance. It was home to David Miller, his 18-year-old son Brandon, and David's second wife, Sarah. On the surface, they were an ordinary American family, but deep cracks hid behind the facade. Brandon was a difficult teenager. The loss of his mother at an early age left an indelible mark on him. When his father remarried, Brandon felt like his world was falling apart. He couldn't accept the new woman in his father's life, seeing her not just as a stepmother, but as a threat to his place in the family. His relationship with Sarah was strained, and the strain only grew with each passing day. David, a successful engineer, tried his best to keep peace in the family. He loved his son, but he also became genuinely attached to Sarah, hoping that time would heal the wounds and they could become a real family. However, his attempts seemed futile because Brandon became increasingly withdrawn, and his jealousy grew into open hostility. Sarah, realizing that she would never replace Brandon's mother, tried to be patient and considerate. But even her best efforts were met with coldness and rejection from the young man. The internal conflict gradually destroyed the family, but no one could have imagined that it would lead to tragedy. The morning that Nancy Olson, the Miller's neighbor, stepped out onto her porch, she had no idea that she was about to witness one of the most shocking events of her life. She often noticed Brandon leaving the house early in the morning to go for a run. This day was no exception. However, there was something in the air that made her pause at the window and take a closer look. The Miller family, outwardly prosperous and wealthy, hid many secrets that none of the neighbors suspected. In this house, which seemed a model of calm and order, a crisis was brewing that would soon develop into a tragedy that shook the entire suburb. On a typical morning in Sacramento, life went on as usual. Nancy Olson, the Miller's neighbor, was making her morning coffee as usual, enjoying the peace and quiet of her home. Her window overlooked the Miller's backyard, and although she wasn't one to spy on her neighbors, something caught her eye that day. Nancy barely glanced out the window when she noticed something strange in her neighbor's backyard. At first glance, she thought it was just a fallen piece of patio furniture or an abandoned item, but then she realized it was a motionless body. Her heart began to beat faster and she knew something was wrong. Nancy put down her coffee and hurried to the window, trying to see what exactly had happened. As she got closer, she realized that Sarah Miller, Brandon's stepmother, was lying on the ground. Sarah was not moving, and her body was twisted strangely. Nancy, without waiting for her to fully process what she had seen, grabbed the phone and called the police. Her voice shook as she explained to the dispatcher that there was a woman lying in the neighbor's backyard and that she appeared to be dead. When the police arrived, the street was already starting to come alive. Several neighbors, noticing the commotion, came out onto their porches, trying to figure out what had happened. The police cordoned off the area, not allowing anyone to approach the scene. An ambulance soon arrived, but the medical team only confirmed Sarah's death. That was the moment when it became clear. Something terrible had happened. Detective Linda Hart arrived on the scene to a street already full of curious neighbors. Linda was an experienced investigator, and she was immediately drawn to details that could point to the cause of the incident. First, she noticed the position of Sarah's body. It was clearly not the result of an accident. The injuries found on the body indicated violent death, which immediately moved the case to the category of homicide. Brandon and David were inside the house when the detective entered. David was clearly shaken, his face pale and his eyes full of terror. Brandon, on the other hand, seemed calm, but his gaze was empty and distant. Linda noticed this, but decided not to rush things for now, concentrating on collecting evidence and interviewing possible witnesses. The house was thoroughly searched. There was no evidence of forced entry, ruling out robbery. Linda knew that the killer was likely someone close to her, someone who had access to the house and knew how to avoid suspicion. She began by questioning David, trying to understand if he or his wife had any enemies or ill-wishers. David could barely speak. He claimed that their family was quite ordinary, without any serious conflicts with anyone in their environment. However, when Linda moved on to Brandon, she noticed that the young man was too calm for a man who had just lost his stepmother. He answered questions in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact. This alerted the detective, but she decided not to press the young man, realizing that there was still a lot of work ahead to establish all the details. Nancy, who called the police, reported her observations. She recalled seeing Brandon out for a run that morning as usual, but something about his behavior seemed odd to her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she was alarmed by his cold expression and the fact that he returned home earlier than usual. The evidence collected by the police, including footprints on the ground and the condition of Sarah's body, began to form a coherent picture. But for Linda and her team, this was only the beginning of a complex investigation that involved not only finding the killer, but also understanding what led to such a terrible ending. The family that seemed perfect suddenly found itself at the center of tragedy, and each of its members could be involved in this tragedy. The investigation into Sarah Miller's murder took a new turn. Detective Linda Hart and her team began methodically collecting and analyzing evidence, trying to build a chronology of events and understand what could have led to this tragedy. The first day after the body was discovered was a flurry. The Millers' home was constantly occupied by police, forensics experts, and detectives, trying to find anything that might shed light on the crime. Every object, every little detail was examined under a microscope. Attention was focused on anything that might indicate the nature of the family's relationships, especially between Brandon and his stepmother. By the evening of the same day, Linda Hart began more in-depth questioning. First in line was David Miller. He was in a state of shock and could hardly comprehend what had happened. The detective carefully asked him about his family life, about his relationship with his son and with Sarah. David tried to explain that his marriage to Sarah was a happy one, although he admitted that Brandon did not immediately accept his new wife. According to David, Brandon became very withdrawn after his mother's death. He dealt with the loss in his own way, withdrawing into himself and having little contact with his father. When David began dating Sarah, Brandon reacted negatively, but over time he seemed to come to terms with their relationship. However, Detective Hart sensed something was wrong. She watched David's reactions closely, noting how his voice shook when he mentioned his son and how he avoided the topic of how Brandon was really feeling. The next step was to question the neighbors. Nancy Olson, who first discovered the body, provided important information. She said that she had seen Brandon jogging the day of the murder and that he had returned home earlier than usual. Nancy also mentioned that Brandon had seemed more depressed and distant in recent weeks, and that he and Sarah had often argued. These words led Linda to believe that the family relationships were much more strained than David was letting on. Linda decided to delve deeper into Brandon's past, studying his school records and talking to his teachers and friends. She discovered that Brandon was withdrawn and prone to depression, but had never been violent. However, in recent months, his behavior had become more erratic. One of Brandon's friends, whom Linda found through social media, said that Brandon often complained about his stepmother. He believed that Sarah was taking away his father's attention and trying to control his life. These conversations, according to the friend, were full of negativity and bitterness, but no one took them seriously. This information spurred Linda to reinterrogate Brandon. This time, she decided to talk to him without his father present. Brandon sat across from her, seemed calm, but his gaze was cold and distant. Linda began with neutral questions, gradually leading him to the topic of his relationship with his stepmother. Brandon admitted that he did not love Sarah and could not accept her as part of his family. He spoke about this calmly, without unnecessary emotion, which made the detective even more wary. When asked where he was at the time of Sarah's death, Brandon answered that he was jogging, but his answers were too vague and the details were vague. Linda understood that she was dealing with a guy who was clearly hiding something, but there was no evidence to prove his involvement in the murder. Time passed, and the investigation required more and more effort. Meanwhile, the forensics team continued their work. They found microscopic traces on Brandon's clothing that could be linked to the crime scene, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. The situation was heating up, and the pressure was mounting on the detective. She knew Brandon was the key to the solution, but she still didn't have enough evidence to definitively connect him to the murder. While going through Sarah's personal belongings, Linda came across her diary. In it, She described her feelings about Brandon and their relationship. Sarah knew that Brandon would never accept her, and this worried her greatly. She wrote about constant conflicts and how she felt like an outsider in her own home. These entries only strengthened Linda's suspicions. Now the detective was sure that the solution to the tragedy was hidden in the relationships within the family. Brandon was on the edge. His jealousy and alienation could push him to a terrible act. But to prove it, Linda needed more evidence, more testimony. She knew that the real work was just beginning, and that every little thing could be decisive in this confusing and dark case. The investigation continued, and each new day brought more questions than answers. Brandon Miller had become the prime suspect in the murder of his stepmother, but there was still a lack of evidence that could firmly connect him to the crime. Detective Linda Hart knew that in order to solve the case, she needed to understand what was going on in the young man's mind and what emotions could have driven him to such a terrible act. Linda's focus was on Brandon's psychology. He was a young man who had faced great adversity from an early age. The loss of his mother, whose place in his heart no one could fill, had profoundly affected his perception of the world. Her death had left a deep wound that would not heal, but only deepened over the years. When his father, David, began dating Sarah, Brandon felt betrayed by his family, that his father was trying to replace someone who could not be replaced. Brandon's emotional reaction seemed understandable, but over time it began to take on darker forms. Sarah, in Brandon's view, was not simply trying to take his mother's place, but was trying to change his life entirely. The young man perceived her as a threat, as an outsider who had invaded his home and taken away his father's attention. Detective Linda Hart decided to seek help from a psychologist who specializes in adolescent psychology. Together, they began to create a psychological profile of Brandon, trying to understand what could have pushed him to commit murder. Brandon grew up as a withdrawn and uncommunicative child. After the death of his mother, he became even more detached. At school, he was known as a quiet and uncommunicative teenager who avoided companies and rarely participated in school life. School teachers and psychologists noted that Brandon often appeared depressed, but his behavior was never out of line. However, as the school psychologist's notes showed, in the months leading up to the murder, his mood worsened significantly. He became irritable, began skipping classes, and avoided socializing with even the few friends he had. One of Brandon's teachers, Mr. Jenkins, recalled Brandon coming to class one day looking stressed. When asked what was wrong, he shrugged and said he was tired of it all. No one thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed more meaningful. Linda Hart also decided to talk to Brandon's neighbors and friends to get a sense of what he was like outside the home. Nancy Olson, the neighbor who first discovered Sarah's body, recalled that Brandon often went for morning jogs. She noted that he seemed more tense than usual lately and was avoiding socializing even with people he had known all his life. Her words were confirmed by her neighbor across the street, Mr. Smith, who noticed that Brandon had become more aggressive in his manner and sometimes had no control over his emotions. Brandon's closest friend, Michael, said they hadn't spoken much in recent months, but when they did, Brandon would often complain about Sarah. He said he felt unwanted in his own home and that Sarah had ruined everything. Michael admitted that Brandon had once even said that she should have been gone. Those words may have been spoken in the heat of the moment, but now they sounded like a harbinger of tragedy. Brandon's psychological profile began to emerge. A young man who lost his mother at an early age, unable to cope with the grief and withdrawn. He perceived any attempt by his father to arrange his personal life as a betrayal. His hatred for Sarah gradually grew into an obsession, which may have been the catalyst for his horrific act. Meanwhile, Linda Hart continued to analyze the evidence. She knew that proving Brandon's involvement in the murder would be difficult, especially given the lack of clear physical evidence. But the young man's emotional state, his aggression and isolation, his alienation from the world around him, all of this was an important background that the detective could not ignore. At the same time, Linda was searching for possible motives that could finally connect Brandon to the crime. She wondered, what could have been the final straw? Had Sarah done something to further increase Brandon's hatred? Or had her very presence in the house, her attempts to replace his mother, become too much for him to bear? These questions remained unanswered, but Linda knew they would lead her to the truth. The detective began to study the family's financial records, emails, and diaries that could shed light on the last months of Sarah and Brandon's lives. Every fact, every detail she found, added up to a picture that was becoming increasingly dark. The entire story, which at first seemed like a simple family drama, was now revealed to be deeply tragic and psychologically complex. Brandon, despite his outward calm, was gripped by an internal conflict, which, in Linda's opinion, led him to his fatal step. She knew that at this stage of the investigation, the most important thing was not to miss a single detail, not a single hint that could shed light on the young man's true motives and actions on that fateful day. As the investigation continued, Detective Linda Hart found herself delving deeper into the murky waters of the Miller family drama. The evidence collected at the crime scene was beginning to come together, but the key piece of evidence linking Brandon to his stepmother's murder remained elusive. Linda knew that to close the case, she needed to find something that would finally confirm her suspicions. The forensic scientists continued to analyze the footprints left at the crime scene. Of particular interest were the shoe prints found near Sarah's body. These prints led to the backyard where Brandon often spent time. Linda asked the experts to compare them with Brandon's shoes, which they found in his room. The results of the analysis showed that the prints were a match, but the forensic scientists were unable to determine the exact time when these prints were left, which created certain difficulties in establishing that Brandon was present at the crime scene at the time of the murder. In addition, microscopic traces of blood were found on Brandon's clothing. These traces were so small that they could have been easily missed if not for the careful work of forensic scientists. Analysis showed that the blood was Sarah's, but the amount was too small to conclude that Brandon was directly involved in the murder. This could mean either accidental blood spillage on the clothing or deliberate concealment of evidence. Linda Hart knew that this was not enough to convict. But these clues, although circumstantial, still supported her suspicions. The detective decided to turn again to witnesses, especially neighbors who might have seen or heard something on the day of the murder. Nancy Olson, the neighbor who first discovered the body, recalled hearing something strange that morning. Her account was confirmed by another neighbor, Mr. Smith. They both heard muffled screams but dismissed them, thinking it might just be another family argument. Mr. Smith, however, added that he had seen Brandon returning home from a jog a few minutes earlier. He seemed more gloomy than usual and did not respond to his greeting. This fact became an important link in the chain of events. If Brandon was indeed home when the screams were heard, it could mean that he had been involved in an argument that had resulted in the murder. Linda began to wonder. Perhaps the murder had not been a premeditated act, but the result of a fit of rage caused by yet another argument? Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their analysis of the diaries and emails they found in the Millers' home. Sarah had written about the last few weeks being particularly tense. She wrote about constant conflicts with Brandon and how he was becoming increasingly withdrawn and aggressive. She even mentioned that one day Brandon yelled at her, saying that she had ruined his life. These entries became important evidence that the relationship between them was much worse than it seemed at first glance. Linda Hart also discovered that Brandon had been searching the internet for information related to violence and self-defense in the days before the murder. His searches were related to how to respond to an attack and how to avoid responsibility for his actions. These searches could have been random, but Linda was certain they were related to his growing tension and inner conflict. The evidence was beginning to fit together. Brandon had a deep hatred for Sarah that was slowly becoming an obsession. Perhaps there had been another argument on the day of the murder that had caused Brandon to lose control. But Linda knew there was still a crucial piece missing that would tie all of these facts together. The detective decided to interrogate Brandon again. She knew he wouldn't confess to the crime, but she wanted to see how he would react to the new information. During the interrogation, Linda tried to ask questions that would cause Brandon to become emotional. She talked about the tracks she found, about Sarah's notes, about what the neighbors knew. Brandon remained outwardly calm, but Linda noticed his hands shaking when she mentioned the screams the neighbors had heard. Brandon continued to deny his involvement in the murder, but his answers became less and less confident. Linda sensed that he was hiding something, that his inner tension was growing. Perhaps his calm was just a mask, hiding deep guilt. Meanwhile, an analysis of Sarah's emails revealed that the day before the murder, she had written to a friend about how difficult it was for her to live with Brandon. In one of the messages, she mentioned that she feared for her life. These words became a significant confirmation that Sarah felt a real threat from her stepson. Linda Hart knew she had to quickly piece together the missing pieces. Time was ticking, and the pressure from the public and her colleagues was mounting. But the detective was confident that the truth would soon come out. Her job was to see the investigation through to the end and bring justice to Sarah Miller, whose life had ended so tragically and so unexpectedly. After weeks of intense investigation, Detective Linda Hart felt she was close to solving the mystery of Sarah Miller's murder. The case was complex and confusing, but now key pieces of evidence were beginning to surface that could finally shed light on what happened. The initial clues, seemingly insignificant, began to take on new meaning when they were put together with other evidence. Linda asked forensic scientists to conduct additional analysis of Brandon's cell phone. Deleted messages and search queries were found on his smartphone, which initially did not attract much attention. After recovering the deleted data, it turned out that Brandon had been actively communicating with an unknown user on one of the social networks a few days before the murder. The correspondence was strange and disturbing. Brandon discussed his feelings of hatred and jealousy, but most importantly, he asked for advice on how to solve the problem with his stepmother. Linda realized that Brandon may have been seeking support from an outsider, trying to justify his inner impulses. This was the first serious lead that could connect him to the intent to commit a crime. Detectives also found drafts of messages on his phone that were never sent. In them, Brandon described his despair and hatred for Sarah, expressing thoughts that her death might bring him relief. These drafts provided important psychological evidence that Brandon had deliberately plotted the murder. But the most important discovery was a surveillance video from a camera a few blocks away from the Millers' home. On the day of the murder, the camera captured a figure that closely resembled Brandon walking toward the house, holding what appeared to be a bag. The time on the video matched the presumed time of Sarah's death. This footage became a key piece of evidence confirming that Brandon was at the crime scene when the murder occurred. Forensic scientists also found Brandon's fingerprints on knives in Sarah's kitchen. The knife used in the murder had been in the dishwasher, but forensic scientists were able to recover the fingerprints left before the knife was thoroughly washed. This supported the theory that Brandon had tried to cover his tracks after the murder, hoping that the police would not find anything suspicious. Linda decided to question Brandon again. She knew she now had enough evidence to put pressure on him. Brandon was called to the police station, and this time, he was in for a very different conversation. Detective Linda Hart calmly but confidently began to reveal to him the evidence she had found: the video, the messages, the marks on the knives. She explained in detail how they were connected to the murder and how they proved his involvement. Brandon was silent at first, his face expressionless, but gradually the detective saw his confidence begin to crack. Linda pressed on his weakest points: his jealousy, hatred, and sense of betrayal. She described how Sarah had been afraid of him, how she had written about her anxiety to a friend. She knew these words could break his emotional barrier. At one point, Brandon couldn't take it anymore. He jumped up from his chair and started screaming that he didn't want this, that he just couldn't take it anymore. These words became a major confession that Linda and her team carefully recorded. Brandon tried to justify himself by claiming that Sarah had always bullied him, that she had taken away everything that was dear to him. He claimed that his father no longer noticed him, that Sarah had become the boss of the house, and that he felt ostracized from his own life. This emotional outburst became the culmination of the investigation. Brandon admitted that on the day of the murder, he returned home earlier than usual after another argument with Sarah. He said that he did not want to kill her, but when she began insulting him again, he lost it. Brandon grabbed a knife and stabbed her several times, not realizing at the time what he was doing. When he realized what he had done, panic overtook him, and he tried to cover his tracks. Brandon's confession was shocking, but Linda knew she now had everything she needed to close the case. The crime had been solved, and all the pieces of the puzzle had come together. The evidence had been collected, the motive had been established, and Brandon was now officially charged with murder. Still, Linda couldn't shake the bitterness. Her work had led to the solution of a crime, but she knew there were no winners in this tragedy. Brandon was a broken young man who had failed to cope with grief and hatred, and his life was now in ruins. Sarah, whose life had been cut so cruelly short, did not deserve such a fate. The case was a reminder of how deeply buried emotions can lead to the most terrible consequences. The investigation was over, but for Linda Hart, it was another hard lesson about human nature and how the dark side of the soul can push a person to commit irreparable acts. The investigation into Sarah Miller's murder was nearing its conclusion, and Detective Linda Hart knew that the key was to get Brandon to confess in order to close the case and prepare the necessary materials for trial. Brandon's confession during interrogation, while emotionally charged, was not the formal admission needed to close the case. After his outburst during the previous interrogation, Linda decided to give him time to calm down. Brandon was placed in a separate cell and spent several hours alone, without contact with the outside world. This was done intentionally, to give him a chance to reflect on his actions and understand that there was no turning back. Linda knew she had to tread carefully to get a formal confession. She had to show Brandon that resistance was futile, and that the only way forward was to accept responsibility for what he had done. She brought in the psychologist who had previously helped her create Brandon's psychological profile. Together, they developed a strategy that would lead Brandon to a final confession. The next day, Linda walked into the interrogation room to find Brandon waiting for her. He looked exhausted, his eyes empty, his shoulders slumped. The detective could tell he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and she knew this was the moment to be gentle, not pushy. She began the conversation by expressing her understanding and sympathy. Linda talked about how hard it must have been for him all these years, how the pain of losing his mother and feeling alone could have led him to such a terrible act. She acknowledged that his life had been full of suffering, and that perhaps he felt trapped. The psychologist who was present at the interrogation added that Brandon probably experienced a lot of internal pressure and could not find a way to cope with these emotions. He talked to Brandon about his childhood, about how he grew up without a mother, how difficult it was for him to accept his father's new wife. All these topics were not chosen by chance. Linda and the psychologist wanted to create an atmosphere in which Brandon would feel understood and not judged. Gradually, the conversation turned to the day Sarah was killed. Linda didn't press Brandon for an immediate confession, but instead asked him to talk about how he felt when the conflict between him and Sarah erupted. Brandon was silent at first, but then, as if opening up, he began to talk. He said he was particularly depressed that day. He felt like his life was spinning completely out of control and that he couldn't find his place in the world. When he got home from his run, he was ready to do anything to stop the chaos that was raging inside him. Sarah was home, and they immediately started fighting. Brandon said that Sarah's words, her tone, her facial expression, all of it hit him in the right places. "She just couldn't shut up," Brandon said, his voice shaking. "She always knew how to make me feel like a loser." Linda listened carefully, letting him talk. Brandon admitted that he hadn't planned to kill her, but at some point his rage got the better of him. He grabbed a knife that was lying on the kitchen table and, in a fit of rage, stabbed her several times. He didn't remember how many times he stabbed her or how Sarah fell. All he remembered was the empty feeling when it was all over. Linda realized that Brandon wasn't making excuses. He was simply telling the story. It was a confession, and although it was framed in emotional turmoil, its essence was clear. Brandon had admitted that he had killed Sarah, and now that confession needed to be documented. Linda asked him to tell it all again, this time more calmly, so that everything he said would be recorded. Brandon seemed to have resigned himself to the inevitable. He repeated his story, this time more subdued, detailing every step, every action, every emotion. The recording was made, and now the detective had an official confession that could be presented in court. Linda then left Brandon alone with the psychologist, who continued the conversation, helping him understand the consequences of his actions and prepare for what lay ahead. Brandon himself was clearly exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and while his confession brought some relief, he still had a long road ahead of him, a road to understanding what he had done. Detective Linda Hart knew her mission was accomplished. She had found the truth, and now it was up to the justice system to bring the case to an end. But for Linda, this case was more than just another investigation. It was a reminder of the importance of understanding people's motives, their internal conflicts, and the struggles that sometimes lead to tragic consequences. Linda knew that the court would likely give Brandon a harsh sentence, and that his life would be ruined forever. But she also knew that the tragedy of this family could have been prevented if help had been provided in time, if Brandon had not been left alone with his demons. It was a bitter realization, but for Linda, it became an important lesson that she will take with her into her future work. After Brandon Miller officially confessed to the murder of his stepmother, Sarah, the case moved to a new stage preparation for trial. For Detective Linda Hart, this was not just the end of another investigation. This case left a deep mark on her professional life and her views on the nature of human relationships. The trial became the center of attention not only for the local community, but also for the general public. The story of how a young man, consumed by jealousy and hatred, killed his stepmother caused a wide resonance. The media covered every detail, which only increased the pressure on all involved. When Brandon first appeared in court, his face was emotionless. He looked dejected and lost, like a man who no longer saw any meaning in his life. His father, David Miller, and several of his immediate family members were present in the courtroom. David was devastated, never able to recover from the tragedy that had torn his family apart. The prosecution presented all the evidence that Detective Hart and her team had collected: the crime scene evidence, the surveillance footage, Brandon's psychological profile, his confession. This material built a continuous chain of evidence linking Brandon to the murder. But even though his guilt was obvious, the defense attorney tried to paint the case in a different light, arguing that Brandon had acted under extreme emotional stress and was not fully aware of his actions. Psychologists called to the trial as experts testified that Brandon suffered from chronic depression and post-traumatic stress disorder following the death of his mother. These factors, according to the defense, may have played a key role in his actions. The defense argued that Brandon did not need prison time, but psychiatric help that could help him recover and understand his mistakes. However, the prosecutor insisted that Brandon had made a conscious decision to kill Sarah, that his actions were the result of pent-up hatred and jealousy. The prosecutor also reminded the court of Brandon's attempts to cover up the crime, which showed that he was aware of his actions and was trying to avoid responsibility. David Miller gave some of the most difficult testimony of the trial. He described how his relationship with his son had deteriorated over time, how he had tried to connect with Brandon, but had always been met with estrangement and hatred. David spoke of how much he loved Sarah and how he had hoped that his son would eventually accept her as part of their family. However, those hopes were dashed overnight when he learned that his son had killed the woman he loved. The trial also heard testimony from Brandon's friends and neighbors. They described him as a withdrawn, distant young man who rarely shared his feelings. Some friends recalled that Brandon had repeatedly expressed his hatred for Sarah, but no one took his words seriously. Now those words seemed like harbingers of a tragedy that no one could prevent. At the end of the trial, the judge handed down the verdict. Brandon Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term with the possibility of parole in several decades. The judge noted that although Brandon acted under the influence of strong emotional distress, his actions were premeditated and he must be held accountable for them. After the verdict was announced, Brandon remained impassive. He accepted his punishment in silence, knowing that his life was now completely destroyed. His father, David, walked out of the courtroom a broken man. He had lost not only his wife but also his son, and the realization was unbearable for him. In the eyes of the public, he was a victim of tragedy, but for him, it was the end of everything he believed in and had built over many years. For Linda Hart, the case was yet another reminder of how fragile human relationships are and how seemingly insignificant conflicts can escalate into something terrible. She knew she had done everything she could to solve the case and get justice for Sarah, but she still felt bitter. She had seen this family crumble from the inside, how unresolved conflicts and suppressed emotions had led to a tragedy that could have been prevented. After the trial ended, Linda decided to take a short vacation. She needed time to process what had happened, to recuperate, and to find the strength to continue her work. She knew that new cases, new investigations lay ahead, but this case would stay with her forever, as a reminder of how important it is not to lose sight of the human side of every crime. Society moved on with its life, oblivious to the tragedy that had shaken it for only a moment. But for those involved, the consequences would remain forever. Brandon Miller's life was now confined to prison walls, his future uncertain and bleak. David Miller was left alone with his grief, and there was no longer any room for hope or joy in his life. This story became a warning to everyone. Even the most prosperous families can hide dark secrets that will one day break out and destroy everything that is dear to them. And although justice was restored, none of the participants in this tragedy was able to emerge victorious.